You know what finally made me stop and rethink how I approach old iron and wood? I was working on a piece of reclaimed white oak from a decommissioned boat. Beautiful timber, dense, tight grain, the kind of wood you just cannot buy anymore. And buried about 4 inches deep was a square-shanked iron bolt that had been rusting in place for the better part of a century. I did what most of us would do. I grabbed a drill and a pry bar and tried to muscle it out. And I split that board right down the center, ruined it. Completely ruined an irreplaceable piece of wood because I was in a hurry. That failure sent me down a path I never expected. I started digging into how the old naval shipwrights handled this exact problem, the men who broke down warships in the Royal Navy dockyards. And what I found was a system of chemical treatments and specialized extraction tools that most modern woodworkers have never heard of. Today, I am going to walk you through exactly what they did, step by step, so you never have to destroy good wood to get bad iron out of it. Plus, stick around to the end, because I have a stain reversal trick that will make black iron tannin stains disappear from oak like they were never there. Let me show you what I learned. What we are talking about today is essentially a lost discipline. The shipwrights who worked in the great naval dockyards had perfected a complete system for extracting rusted iron from valuable timber without damaging it. And for anyone doing antique restoration, timber salvage, or even just working with reclaimed barnwood, these methods are as practical now as they were 200 years ago. So let me start with where this knowledge comes from and why these men were so good at it. During the 18th and 19th centuries, the British Royal Navy operated massive dockyards at Portsmouth, Chatham, and Deptford. When a warship reached the end of its service life, it was not simply scrapped. It was carefully dismantled by teams of shipwrights whose primary job was to save the timber. And here is why. A single warship, like a 74-gun third-rate ship of the line, contained roughly 3,000 loads of English oak. That is somewhere around 6,000 mature trees worth of timber. It took those trees a century or more to grow. The wood was worth far more than the iron fasteners holding it together, and everyone in the dockyard knew it. So these men developed an entire system for getting iron out of oak without splitting, cracking, or crushing the surrounding wood. They used chemistry before we even called it chemistry. They used purpose-built tools that you will not find in any modern woodworking catalog, and they passed these methods down through apprenticeships that lasted 7 years. American colonial shipyards adopted many of the same practices, particularly in Boston, Philadelphia, and Norfolk. The underlying philosophy was simple, and it is something I think about every time I work with old wood now. The timber is the treasure. The iron is just a problem to be solved. Every step in their extraction process was designed around that one idea. Protect the wood first, remove the iron second. Once I understood that priority, everything else made sense. The first thing the old shipwrights did, and the first thing I had to learn to do, was assess the bolt before touching it. This sounds obvious, but it is the step most of us skip entirely. We see a bolt head or a nail, and we immediately reach for a tool to yank it out. The dockyard men took a completely different approach. They would start by examining the head of the fastener to determine what type it was. Square-shanked, rose-headed bolts were the most common in naval construction, and these were typically driven through a pre-bored hole and clenched or peened over a rove on the opposite side. That means pulling from one side alone will not work. You have to know what is happening on the back end. Next, they would probe around the bolt with a thin blade or an awl to feel how much the iron had expanded from rust. Iron oxide takes up roughly 6 to 10 times the volume of the original iron. So a bolt that went in at 3/4 of an inch might now be effectively 1 inch or more in diameter, wedged tight into the surrounding wood with enormous pressure. They also checked the grain direction of the timber relative to the bolt. A bolt running parallel to the grain creates a splitting risk. A bolt running perpendicular is safer to drive out, but harder to access. All of this assessment happened before a single extraction tool was picked up. When I started doing this myself, my success rate went up immediately. Not because I gained any new skill, but because I stopped making blind decisions about what was happening inside the wood. Now, here is where things get genuinely fascinating. The shipwrights discovered that you could chemically dissolve the rust bond between iron and wood using nothing more than vinegar and salt. This was their primary method for loosening a seized bolt, and it works remarkably well. Here is the chemistry behind it. White vinegar is a dilute solution of acetic acid, typically around 5% concentration. When you combine it with coarse salt, which is sodium chloride, you create a mildly aggressive solution that attacks iron oxide directly. The acetic acid breaks down the rust, and the salt acts as an abrasive catalyst that accelerates the reaction. The shipwrights would make what I call a poultice. They soaked rags or oakum in a mixture of vinegar and coarse salt, then packed it tightly around the exposed bolt head and any accessible portion of the shank. Then they wrapped the whole area in more dry rags to hold it in place and slow evaporation. And then they waited. Not 10 minutes, not an hour. They left those poultices in place for 24 to 48 hours, sometimes longer for badly corroded bolts. Every 8 to 12 hours, they would refresh the poultice with fresh solution. What happens over that time is remarkable. The rust gradually dissolves, and the bolt actually shrinks slightly back toward its original diameter. That releases the enormous pressure it was exerting on the surrounding wood fibers. When I first tried this, I was skeptical. I soaked a poultice and wrapped it around a rusted square bolt in a piece of white oak I was trying to salvage. I left it for 36 hours, refreshing it twice. When I came back, I could wiggle that bolt with my fingers. Not much, but enough to feel movement where before there had been absolutely none. The old shipwrights knew exactly what they were doing. They understood the problem was not that the bolt was stuck. The problem was that the rust had turned the bolt into a wedge. Dissolve the rust, and the wedge disappears. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these shipwright methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called Secrets of the Shipyard, and it covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that most woodworkers have never seen. 150 pages of real hands-on knowledge. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen, or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. Once the poultice has done its work and the rust bond is loosened, the next method I learned is one that requires a little more finesse. The shipwrights used controlled heat to expand the wood fibers around the bolt, creating a temporary gap that made extraction easier. But here is the critical part. They did not just blast the area with heat. They used what I think of as a heat ring technique. The idea is to apply heat to the wood surrounding the bolt, not to the bolt itself. If you heat the iron, it expands and grips tighter. If you heat the wood around it, the wood fibers swell outward, and the hole opens up slightly. In the dockyards, they used heated iron rings and controlled charcoal applications. Today, a small propane torch works perfectly. Here is how I do it, based on what I learned. First, I soak a rag in water and wrap it directly around the bolt head. This keeps the iron cool and prevents it from expanding. Then I apply heat from the propane torch in a slow circle around the bolt, about 1 to 2 inches out from the edge of the hole. I keep the flame moving constantly, never hold it in one spot. The goal is to warm the wood evenly to about 200 degrees Fahrenheit, well below the scorching point for oak, which is around 450 degrees. I do this for about 3 to 4 minutes, keeping that wet rag on the bolt refreshed. What happens is exactly what the old shipwrights counted on. The wood expands away from the bolt, the grip loosens, and the bolt can be driven or drawn out with far less force. The key detail that makes this work is the wet rag on the iron. Without it, you are just making the problem worse. Every modern restoration shipwright I have spoken to still uses some version of this technique, and they all emphasize the same thing. Cool iron, warm wood. That is the entire principle. Now we get to the actual physical extraction, and this is where the shipwrights had purpose-built tools that most of us have never seen. The two primary extraction tools were the drift pin and the hollow punch. A drift pin is simply a tapered steel rod. The shipwrights kept sets of them in graduated diameters from about 1/4 inch up to 1 inch or more. The idea is to select a drift pin slightly smaller than the bolt shank, position it against the end of the bolt, and drive it through with a heavy mallet using controlled even blows. You always drive from the clenched end if possible, pushing the bolt back out the way it went in. This is important because the entry side of the hole is typically slightly larger due to how the bolt was originally driven. You are following the path of least resistance. For bolts where the head is inaccessible or the shank has corroded to the point where a drift pin cannot find purchase, they used a hollow punch. This is a steel tube with a sharpened edge that fits around the bolt. You drive the hollow punch down around the bolt shank, and it cuts a clean channel through any remaining rust and compressed wood fiber. It essentially rebores the hole around the bolt, while the bolt is still in it. Once the channel is cut, the bolt drops free. I had a blacksmith make me a set of 3 hollow punches in different diameters, and they have become some of the most valuable tools in my shop for this kind of work. The combination of the vinegar poultice to dissolve the rust, the heat ring to loosen the wood, and the drift pin or hollow punch to drive the bolt out cleanly is the complete system. Each step makes the next one easier. Skip any one of them, and you are back to forcing things and risking the timber. Let me share some patterns I have noticed over the years, things I used to do myself that this tradition handles completely differently. No judgment here. I did all of these for longer than I would like to admit. The first pattern is reaching for a reciprocating saw to cut the bolt in place. Most of us do this because it feels fast and decisive, but a recip saw generates enormous vibration, and in old, dry timber, that vibration can propagate cracks along the grain for inches beyond the cut. The shipwrights never used force that transmitted shock into the surrounding wood. Every tool they picked up was designed for controlled, localized pressure. The second pattern is drilling out a rusted bolt with a standard twist bit. I did this for years because it seemed logical. But a twist bit wanders when it hits uneven rust, and it chews up the wood around the hole unpredictably. You end up with an oversized, ragged hole that is much harder to plug cleanly. The hollow punch approach cuts a precise, uniform channel because the bolt itself acts as the centering guide. The third pattern is ignoring the rust expansion problem entirely and just trying to pull harder. This is the one that cost me that beautiful piece of white oak I mentioned at the beginning. When a bolt has been rusting in place for decades, the expansion forces are enormous. No amount of pulling force from a pry bar is going to overcome that without splitting the wood first. The poultice method addresses the actual cause of the problem instead of fighting the symptom. The fourth pattern is applying heat directly to the bolt. This is intuitive, but wrong. Hot iron expands. Expanded iron grips harder. The shipwrights understood this, which is why their entire heat technique is built around warming the wood and cooling the iron. It is exactly the opposite of what most of us would instinctively do. Once you see these patterns for what they are, you realize the old shipwrights were not doing anything magical. They were just thinking about the problem more carefully than most of us take the time to do. Now, for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning, once you get a rusted bolt out of oak, you are almost always left with a dark black stain in the surrounding wood. That stain is iron tannate, a chemical compound formed when dissolved iron reacts with the tannins in the oak. It can penetrate a 1/4 inch or more into the wood fibers, and sanding it out means removing a lot of material. The old shipwrights had a solution for this too, and it is surprisingly simple. They used lye. Lye is sodium hydroxide, and when you apply a solution of it to an iron tannin stain, it breaks the chemical bond between the iron and the tannin and lifts the discoloration out of the wood. You can do this today with a teaspoon of lye crystals dissolved in about 1 cup of warm water. Brush it onto the stain, let it sit for 15 to 20 minutes, then neutralize it with a wipe of white vinegar and rinse with clean water. The stain will lighten dramatically, often disappearing almost completely after 2 applications. If you cannot find lye or prefer something a little less caustic, oxalic acid works through a similar mechanism and is sold in most hardware stores as deck brightener or wood bleach. I keep both in my shop now. This one trick alone has saved me from discarding timber that I thought was permanently ruined. It is the kind of quiet, practical knowledge that the dockyard men took for granted, but that most of us never learned. Now, if this kind of traditional shipwright knowledge is something you want to keep learning from, I have written a guide called Secrets of the Shipyard. It covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that have been perfected over centuries. The kind of stuff you will not find in most modern woodworking books. Scan the QR code right now or check the first link below. All right, let us continue. Here's what I want to leave you with. The next time you come across a piece of old timber with rusted iron buried in it, slow down. Do not reach for the pry bar. Do not fire up the recip saw. Treat that timber the way the old shipwrights treated it, as something worth saving. Assess the bolt, dissolve the rust, warm the wood, cool the iron, and drive it out clean. The wood will thank you for it, and so will whatever you build next.